On the pasuk v'chisavoyo la'aretz, when you come into the land, you'll plant a fruit tree. Va'araltim, you have to keep the fruits as arla. Then the pasuk says, Shalosh shanim yeh lachem arelim, for 3 years these fruits will be arla, lo yachal, it's not allowed to be eaten. Rashi quotes the word Shalosh shanim yeh lachem arelim and explains, me'emos haymoinaloi, from when do you start counting? Misha'as netiyasoi, from the time of planting. What's Rashi trying to say over here? So the Mefarshim explain that Rashi is clarifying that the 3 years are not from the time that the tree starts producing fruit, but rather from the time that you planted it. And where do we know this from? Because the pasuk starts off with unatatem, you'll plant these fruit trees. This is to teach you that you count from the time of the planting. But the Rebbe says, if the way Rashi knows this, that you count from the time of planting, is from the word unatatem, then Rashi should have quoted this word in the Dibur HaMaschil, unatatem. The question is even stronger. The source of this Rashi is in the Torah's Koyanim. In the Torah's Koyanim, in fact, he brings this limud in continuation to other drashes on the words unatatem, but Rashi changes from the Torah's Koyanim and brings it on the words shalosh shanim yeh lachem arelim, that it will be arla for you for 3 years, and doesn't mention at all the word unatatem. The Rebbe asks another question, that if in fact not for the word unatatem, then in Pshutei Shel Mikra, how do we know that it's from the time of planting and not from the time of when the fruits start growing? And finally, one more question that the Rebbe asks is, what is this arichus in Rashi? Why is Rashi using seemingly so many words, both in quoting from the pasuk, where Rashi says, Shalosh shanim yeh lochem arelim, and also in his own pirush, where he says, Me'emos haymoinalei, from when do you start counting? Rashi seemingly could have been much more brief. He could have quoted from the pasuk just the words, Shalosh shanim, 3 years, and then just explain mish'as netiyasoi, from the time of planting. What's this whole thing? From when do you start counting? Now, even though this is the lashon in the Torah's Koyanim, but as discussed many times, that Rashi, this style in Pirushi ala Torah, is not to just quote the words of the Razal exactly as they are in their original. Rashi is coming to explain Pshutei Shel Mikra, and therefore, very often Rashi omits or changes from the words of Razal in accordance to what's needed for the Pirush HaKasav according to Pshutei Shel Mikra. Says the Rebbe, the explanation is, what's bothering Rashi here is the arichus in the pasuk itself, the seemingly extra words in the pasuk itself, where the pasuk says, Shalosh shanim yeh lochem arelim, for 3 years it will be for you arla. The pasuk started off by saying, Va'araltem es arla sayas period. You'll keep these fruits as arla. Why does the pasuk repeat again and say, Yeh lochem arelim, it will be arla for you? It could have just said, after the words Va'araltem arla sayas period, it could have just said, Shalosh shanim. Why Shalosh shanim yeh lochem arelim? So Rashi takes from this, Rashi learns from this, that in arla there are in fact 2 things. On the one hand, there is what we call the isur on the cheftza. There is the object itself of arla itself, the fruit itself becoming osur. Va'araltem or losayes perioi, as Rashi says, yei atum v'nistam. It should be blocked, it should be closed off from being able to benefit from it. That's one thing. But from these words, Shalosh shanim yeh lochem arelim, Rashi learns another thing, that there is a count of 3 years, that this is a din on the person. Shalosh shanim yeh lochem arelim, you, the person, has to be counting these 3 years. And this is what Rashi means with his arichos halashon, me'emos haymoinaloi, from when do you start counting? From the time of planting. In other words, that there's a certain concept, a certain halacha, that the person needs to be counting the 3 years. And from when do these 3 years start? And how do we know from when these 3 years start? Says the Rebbe, this is what Rashi is telling us. Since the counting is lochem, since it's a counting of the person, so it makes sense that these 3 years should be figured out, should be counted, should be calculated, not from when the time when the tree starts producing fruit, because we're not speaking about the tree in essence or the fruit in essence right now. We're speaking about the person's counting. So it makes sense that it should be from the time that the person did an act with the fruit, from when the time the person planted the tree. And that's what it means when Rashi says, from when do we count it? It's when the person planted the tree, and that's again because of because it's about the person's count. Says the Rebbe, based on this, there will be another difference that comes out. Since it's moinalei mishas netiyasai, Since the fact that you're counting from the planting is because of this minion that we said, this counting that needs to be lochem, is to do with a person. So what should then be the result is that the 3 years that we say that come from planting should be counted, should be calculated not according to the tree, but according to the person, to the lochem. What does that mean? The difference will be as follows. Do we count the 3 years according to the tree or according to the person? Where would we see that difference is in a case where you took a branch from the tree, a tree that was already 3 years old, and you're going to replant this branch now. If we should count according to the tree itself, in other words, we're just focused on the tree, just not on the person, then it makes sense to say that since this branch went through the 3 years of Arla already, then seemingly the fruits that grow from this branch should be immediately permissible. It shouldn't need another 3 years of Arla. If, on the other hand, we should be counting the 3 years according to the person who planted it, the lochem, so then what should come out is that we should start counting again the 3 years from when the person is doing this new planting. According to this will come out that Rashi in his Pirush al HaTorah, al derech hapshat, which is telling us that there needs to be this counting of lechem, which now we understand that meaning that this new branch will need a new 3 years of orla that will fit with the Chelek halacha sheb'Torah, because the halacha actually is that whether one plants a new tree or he takes and bends down a branch from an old tree and is replanting it, it will be chayiv and orla starting from this point of when this was replanted. According to this, says the Rebbe, we'll understand another thing in this Rashi. Because Rashi continues within the same Dibur HaMaschil. After saying, from when do you count from the time of planting? Rashi says, you might think that if you took a fruit from the 3 years and you stored it away, you put it away, you might think that that fruit after the 3 years will now become permissible. Talmud Loimar, the Pasuk says, Yihiyeh, from which we learn out that it always will remain in the way it was originally. It was a forbidden fruit. It's going to remain forbidden even after the 3 years. And the question is, these 2 points of the Rashi, the first point, that you count from the time of planting. The second point, that you might think that if you put away a fruit from the first 3 years, it will be mutar later, seemingly have no connection to each other. The part of Rashi that discusses from when you count is coming to explain the words of the Pasuk, Shalei Shanim. The Pasuk says Shalei Shanim. Rashi is teaching us from when you count to 3 years. When Rashi says Yochelim Etzniyadi, you might think that if you put away a fruit from those 3 years for later, seemingly that is to do with the next words of the Pasuk of Yiyeh Lochem Arelim, which Rashi is saying that we're learning from the word Yiyeh, that the fruit remains forbidden. So Rashi should have divided into 2 separate Rashis, 2 different Dibur HaMaschils, as he often does. Why is Rashi bringing these 2 ideas in one continuation, in one flow, in the same Dibur HaMaschil? The question is even stronger. When we look at the source of where this comes from, this part of the Rashi, Yochelim Etzniyoi, is also coming from the Toras Kohanim. But in Toras Kohanim, in fact, it does not come as one continuation to the other idea of Me'emos Aimoina from when you count. It's a totally separate limud for itself. So why is Rashi changing from the Toras Kohanim and joining these 2 limudim together? Says the Rebbe, but based on what we said before, it's all going to be understood. And that is as follows. Since the Pasuk emphasized, and we explained that to mean that there's a special din that the person has to be making the one to count. So then the following is what could now enter your mind. This is what you can think based on that. That perhaps this idea that the person is counting is not only as far as the 3 years count is to do that the person has to count it, but now you might say that the general Isur of Arla is not an Isur, an essential Isur on the fruit itself. You might think the whole thing is only to do lochem. It's only an Isur on the person. That's what you might think. And when the Pasuk says, Yiyeh lochem arelim, this is the way you would have understood it, are not only coming to add to the words, are not as an addition to the words, Va'araltemis period. In other words, that it's only a din in the counting of the 3 years, but perhaps we would have thought that this is the explanation of Va'araltemis period. In other words, the Pasuk starts off Va'araltemis Arlosayas period, and the Pasuk is explaining that the whole Isur of Arla is Yiyeh lochem arelim, that it's only an Isur Gavra, only an Isur on the person. That's again what we possibly could have thought. And if in fact we should say that the Isur of Orla is not on the fruits itself, it's only Yeh Lochem Arelim, in other words, it's completely only an Isur on the person not to eat the fruit of the first 3 years, then perhaps there's room to say that after the 3 years, there shouldn't be the Isur of Orla even on fruits that grew during the 3 years. In other words, we would have said that Orla is purely an Isur Gavra, Orla is purely an Isur on the person, because Yeh Lochem Arelim, it's an Isur that's dependent on time, Shalosh Shonim, like the Isur of Achilas Chametz b'Pesach. In the footnotes, the Rebbe elaborates a little bit about this, of what happens with Chametz after Pesach, and so on. In other words, you could say that it's only an Isur for a particular amount of time that the person was not allowed to eat it. But therefore, if he put it away, and then after 3 years, you should be allowed to eat it, because the Zman of the Isur passed. So again, just to go back for a minute to clarify what the Rebbe just said. In other words, it's based on the beginning of Rashi that we have this new concept of Yeh Lochem Arelim, that there's a count of the person in Orla, that we could have thought that the whole Isur of Orla then, perhaps, is only an Isur on the person. So now this is why Rashi continues and says, so you may have thought then that after 3 years that fruit would become mutter, the fruit that grew in the 3 years. So Rashi goes on and says, no, the Pasuk says, that it will remain also, that the Isur of Orla is in fact always remaining in the fruits, even after the 3 years. Because why? Because it's not an Isur just on the Gavra, on the person. It is actually an Isur on the Chefza, on the very essence of the fruit itself, and therefore always remains also. Yes, there's a separate din that the person has to count as far as the counting of the 3 years from the time of planting, but the Isur itself remains an essential Isur Chefza on the object itself. The Rebbe says the inner reason why we have this difference between Isurei Gavra and Isurei Chefza, certain Isurim are purely on the person and certain Isurim are on the object itself. Says the Rebbe, we could say it depends on where the chayas, the energy, the vitality of the object is coming from. Isurei Chefza, something that we say is essentially Asur, means that this object is something that's getting its chayas, a forbidden vitality, a forbidden life force. It's coming from the shalish klipos hatmeis lagamri, from those 3 completely tamei klipos which can never be elevated into kedusha, and that's why it's a chefta, it's an object of isur, it's forbidden forever. Contrast that with isurei gavra. These are things that are just getting an ordinary chayas from klipas noiga. In other words, more of a neutral type of chayas, which can be elevated into kedusha, and that's why the chefta, the object itself, is considered heter. It's not completely tied down and bound and essentially usur. It's only that the person was told that he's not allowed to eat it. In other words, there's a certain isur on the person to eat it, and so on. Peiros Arla, we just established, are essentially usur. It's an isur chefza. Again, it's not only about the person's count. The person's count was one thing, but the object itself of the Arla is completely usur. It's isur chefza. Because their chayis comes from the shalosh klipos hatmeyos, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya. But the Rebbe asks a question. How does this work? The tree itself, of a arla tree, is actually mutter. The fruits are the ones that are usr. The tree itself would be mutter. So the Rebbe doesn't go into all of this, but for example, the branches and other aspects of the tree is mutter. Now, the fruit is getting its life force from the tree. So how does this make sense? How can it be that the tree itself should be davar amutar, in other words, klipas noiga, and the fruits that are coming from it should be a chefta shalisar, should be essentially also completely forbidden, in other words, shalosh klipas hatmeyos? And the Rebbe elaborates on the question and clarifies the question. If we would say that any fruits coming from this tree forever would be asur, in other words, even fruits that grow after the 3 years, that wouldn't be such a problem, because then the way we would explain it is that this element, this part of the chayas of the tree, from which fruit get their nourishment, that aspect of the tree, that chayas is from shalosh klipas hatmeyos, and the rest of the tree is not. But since after the 3 years, any fruit growing after the 3 years from this tree will be mutar, that means even the part of the tree that gives the life to those fruits is not from shalosh klipas hatmeyos. So how do the fruits of the 3 years become a chefza shalisar? How are they essentially also? What's going on over here? Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this by first having a look at the Alter Rebbe's wording in Tanya. When the Alter Rebbe speaks about macholis asuris, forbidden fruit that come from things that grow, the Alter Rebbe says, for example, orlo, kloya kerem, and so on. So the Alter Rebbe says that their kiyum and chayus, that their existence and their life force is from shalish klipis hatmeyos. The Rebbe Rashab is medayik. He contrasts this with what says regarding non-kosher animals. Here by Arla and Kloya Kerem, it doesn't say the words Vikiyum Gufam in the existence of their body, as opposed to by the non-kosher animals that are Asur Ba'achila, where the Alter Rebbe says that not only their soul, but even Kiyum Gufam, the existence of their very body, is from Shalosh Klipis Hatmeis. So why by Arla does the Alter Rebbe not say Kiyum Gufam, the very Guf of the Arla? So the Alter Rebbe says, because in the case of Arla Sharei Gufam, the Rebbe Rashab says, that over here, Sharei Gufam Tar, their Guf is Tar. And the Rebbe says, seemingly, this is not understood. Peiros Arla, the fruits that grew in those first 3 years are Asur La'olam, are Asur forever. So then seemingly, the Kiyum Gufam, the very body of that fruit, seemingly is Shalosh Klipis Hatmeis. And if you're going to say, it's because the fruit are coming from a tree, which we said the tree is Davar Hamutar, so they're getting their nourishment from this tree. But if that's the case, then even the chayas of the fruit is coming from the tree, and therefore the chayas should also be klipas noiga. But the Alter Rebbe is that the chayas of the fruit is shalosh klipas atmeis. So how do we understand this? So the Rebbe explains that the difference between when we say kiyum gufam, the existence of the body, or kiyum v'chayas, when we speak about the vitality, the energy, is the actual body or the materialistic, the physical part of a nivra, of a created being, that is created one time. And then afterwards, it's only given in other words, to keep up the existence of that which was existing earlier already. But the body itself is the same body. And therefore, in the body itself, there won't be a shinu, there won't be a change as time goes on. It won't change the type of existence that it is. In other words, whether it's Risholish Klipas Atameus or Klipas Noiga. The Rebbe says by itself it wouldn't change, because sometimes a person's act, as the Rebbe elaborates in the footnote, could change something. In other words, it's not going to change the source from where Kiyum Gufam is coming from. As opposed to the Chayas, the energy, the life force inside of the Tzomeach and Doimim, this is something that's being renewed constantly. As explained in a number of places on the meaning of the words Hamachadesh Betuvay B'chol Yom Tomid Maasev Reishes, that Hashem is renewing the creation every single day in His goodness, but that every single day there's a new chayas, there's a new energy, and that's why, as far as the energy is concerned, again, as opposed to the guf, in the energy there could be changes and there could be differences, and this will explain to us what's happening by Arla. The actual body and the gashmi is like a part of the tree, which is a dover tar, remains tar, is tar and remains tar. Because in that there can't be any change compared to the way it was previously. As opposed to the chayas, the energy, the koyach with which the tree is making the fruit grow, and the fruit are going to be getting their nourishment from this tree. So here we say, as far as the chayas that's inside of that, so then we'll say that the 3 years, there's a chayas of sholosh klipis hatmeyos, that's what's feeding into these fruits, and this is what's causing the peiros to be an isur chefza, that are going to be essentially usher forever because of the time that they were receiving this chayas. That's what made them grow. But afterwards, there's a whole new chayas coming through the tree, a chayas chadash, a renewed chayas, which the fruits that are going to be growing from this chayas in the 4th year are not only going to be tahir and permissible, but rather, as the pasuk says, kodesh, they're going to be considered holy, hilulim la Hashem, to bring forth praise to Hashem.